My name is Maria Dalton, and I am about to turn 27 this year. I've been married to my husband for 5 years now, and we have a son named Martin who just turned 4. Initially, after tying the knot, I worked as a full-time employee, but now I'm working part-time at the same company. My husband is 3 years older than me at 30. I was initially swept off my feet by Kevin Carlton's passionate gestures, which ultimately led us to date and eventually get married. However, Kevin's demeanor shifted after marriage, revealing a more domineering side that I hadn't seen before. Kevin's sister, Jane Dalton, who is 20 years old, seems to hold a special place in his heart, perhaps due to their significant age gap. Before our marriage, I didn't pay much attention to their dynamic, assuming they got along well. However, after tying the knot, I started noticing changes in Jane's behavior. Jane frequently drops by our house unannounced, expecting to be catered to regardless of the time. She never brings any gifts or shows any appreciation during her visits. Instead, she acts as though I'm invisible, addressing only Kevin with a casual "brother, I'm here again." Despite my discomfort, Kevin always accommodates Jane's demands, even if it means inconveniencing me. For instance, during dinner, Kevin invites Jane to eat, leaving me to scramble and make do with what's available, regardless of my prior preparations. When I express my concerns to Kevin, he brushes them off, insisting that I should accommodate his sister. Kevin's preferential treatment towards Jane is evident, and it often leaves me feeling marginalized and disheartened. Despite Jane's verbal apologies, her actions suggest she revels in Kevin's attention at my expense. Left to fend for myself during meal times, I'd often resort to leftovers, resigned to the fact that I'm on the lower rung of Kevin's priorities. This pattern repeats when Jane requests a private conversation with Kevin, prompting me and Martin to relocate, once again highlighting my secondary status in our household. As Martin and I finish our meal and head to the kitchen for cleanup, I can't help but feel the weight of Kevin's favoritism and Jane's entitlement, casting a shadow over our family dynamic. I find Kevin and Jay chatting happily on the sofa, ignoring the dishes left untouched on the dining table. Their negligence toward cleaning up suggests they see me not as a wife or sister-in-law, but more like a maid. They don't acknowledge Martin either, treating him as if a maid brought her child to work. While I'm cleaning up in the kitchen, about to take a bath with Martin, Kevin loudly calls me, despite the late hour nearing 8 p.m. He demands that I buy a cake for Jay immediately, specifying where to get it, despite the inconvenience it poses to Martin's bedtime. Jane adds to the pressure, insisting she wants it now, and Kevin rushes me, displaying his frustration at my hesitation. Knowing I'll inevitably have to go, I reluctantly agree to buy the cake, aware that a shop near the station closes at 9 p.m. As I prepare to leave, I overhear Kevin and Jane's conversation, criticizing me loudly, questioning why Kevin married me. Reluctant to leave Martin behind, I bring him along. While getting him ready, I hear Kevin's threatening tone from the living room, causing Martin to sense the tension, even if he doesn't understand the words. Suppressing my emotions, I ask Martin what kind of cake he wants, and he brightens up, expressing his preference for a fruit-loaded one. Our trip to the cake shop becomes a momentary escape from the conflict, as Martin excitedly discusses cake flavors. We reach the shop just before closing time, luckily finding the cake Jane wanted. I buy 2 cakes, including the fruit-loaded one for Martin. Returning home, I serve the cakes to Jane and Kevin, then prepare Martin's cake. However, before he can enjoy it, Jane demands it for herself, and Kevin, disregarding Martin's protests, sides with Jane, claiming his right to choose. Unable to contain my frustration, I express my dissatisfaction, prompting Kevin to threaten divorce. Martin, visibly distressed, holds my hand tightly, and after some consideration, he speaks up, expressing his love for strawberry cake, a preference he mentions while eating the cake Jane initially wanted. I feel like I've been subjecting Martin to too much. 3 adults, including myself, shouldn't be burdening a 4-year-old child like this. The moment I saw Jane reaching for Martin's cake, After hearing him express how delicious it was, I knew I had to intervene. "Martin, let's go over there," I said, leading him to another room so he could enjoy his cake in peace. Kevin, likely noticing Jane's attempt to take the cake, apologized to her for seeming stingy. As much as I wanted to retort, I held back, not wanting to expose Martin to talk of divorce. Watching him innocently eat his cake, with a smile on his face, was heartwarming and offered a moment of solace amidst the tension. After finishing the cake, ignoring both Kevin and Jane, we decided to have a late bath and sleep in Martin's bed. The next morning, I woke up to find Jane had already left. As I prepared to wake up Kevin and Martin for breakfast, I heard Martin crying and rushed to him. To my shock, I found his piggy bank, a gift from my father, broken, and all his saved money gone. It was part of his nightly ritual to say goodnight to the piggy bank, and last night was no different. At that time, the only people in the living room were Kevin and Jane. I asked Kevin about it, and he casually mentioned that Jane needed some money, so she took it from Martin's piggy bank, ignoring his tears. As I held Martin, feeling his pain so deeply, I couldn't help but cry with him. It hurt to see Kevin prioritize and care for Jane over our own son. I felt a surge of anger and sadness, unable to bear the sight of Martin in such distress. "Why are you making the morning so miserable? I feel awful," Kevin exclaimed. "Don't you think you've done something wrong? Martin is crying so much for the first time since we got married." I expressed my anger towards him. Kevin looked at me intensely, then went to the bedroom without a word. He returned with something in his hand, divorce papers. "If you're not happy with me, then let's divorce," he said, thrusting the papers at me before leaving the house with a loud bang. Martin, who had never cried over issues with Kevin and Jane before, must have reached his limit. He's been crying since last night, and I can't bear to see him in such pain. "Hey, Martin, should we skip daycare today?" I asked, trying to comfort him. He seemed happy at the idea of spending the day with me, replying with a loud yes and showing me a faint smile. As he brought a picture book from the shelf and sat on my lap, looking up at me with happiness, I couldn't help but think that his little heart must be full of patience. Today, we'll take it easy. I made a decision to fill Martin's heart with as much joy as possible. While I might be causing some inconvenience at my workplace, my colleagues kindly understood the situation and granted me a day off, encouraging me to spend quality time with Martin. In the morning, we went to the park where we played hide and seek, laughed in the sandbox, and gleefully slid down the slides. Returning home for lunch, Martin seemed drowsy, a rare occurrence for him. Normally, he can nap by himself, but today he fell asleep on my lap, reminiscent of his baby days. Instead of tackling household chores while Martin napped, I decided to cherish this special moment and be comforted by his peaceful sleeping face and gentle breathing. As I drifted off myself, a noise from the entrance jolted me awake. It was too early for Kevin to be home, so I felt a sense of unease. Quickly, I gathered Martin and only essentials, hiding in the bedroom closet. My heart raced as I heard footsteps approaching. Then, a familiar voice echoed through the house. It was Jane, trembling with fear. I listened as she rummaged through drawers, muttering about something she couldn't find. After a brief call to Kevin, Jane left, locking the door behind her. Emerging from the closet, I put Martin back to bed, pondering what had just transpired. I couldn't shake the feeling that Kevin was involved somehow, and I began to question his actions. Feeling a mixture of disgust and fear towards Kevin, I hastily packed essentials for Martin and myself. By the time Martin woke up, I was ready to go. "Martin, let's go to Grandpa's place," I said, and we headed to the station, taking a train to my parents' house. Thankfully, my parents' home was nearby, and we arrived quickly. Although I hadn't informed them beforehand, they'd welcomed us with open arms, sensing something was amiss. Their pet dog immediately brought joy to Martin, and they played together happily. Feeling relieved, I confided in my parents about the unsettling events with Kevin and Jane. We discussed the possibility that Jane may have been searching for my belongings, particularly my cash cards. Reflecting on my mother's insight, I remembered my successful experience in launching an online shop for handmade goods with my friends. Before getting married, I was well known in the handmade industry, serving as the CEO of my own shop. As the business flourished, I made the decision to tie the knot. However, my priorities shifted towards raising my child, prompting me to entrust the company to my reliable friends until I settled into parenthood. Although I still hold the CEO position, I primarily work part-time from home, managing the company remotely. Surprisingly, my husband, Kevin, is unaware of my continued role as CEO, although he knows about my previous position and suspects that I've saved a decent amount of money. I've intentionally kept details about my CEO status and savings from Kevin, mainly due to his poor financial habits. Despite earning a substantial income, Kevin spends recklessly, leaving little for essential expenses. He allocates a mere $200 per month for food, insisting I become a full-time homemaker. However, I've never agreed to abandon my career entirely. Eventually, he allowed me to work part-time, but not without making me sign a post-marital property waiver, fearing I might consider divorce. Since Martin's birth, I've solely relied on the $200 food budget, using my savings to cover Martin's nursery fees and clothing expenses. I've never asked Kevin for additional financial support, leading him to assume I have substantial savings. Jane's sudden need for money aligns with Kevin's belief in my savings, likely prompting their search for my cash cards. Nevertheless, I've been quietly setting aside funds for Martin in a separate savings account. Each month, a portion of my salary is deposited directly into this account. Despite their efforts, they won't find my cash cards, as I always carry them with me, concerned about Jane's frequent visits and Kevin's allowance of them. I've decided to keep my valuables at my parents' house, storing them securely in their safe. Martin's distress over his broken piggy bank further raises suspicions. My father, visibly angered by Martin's plight, insists on contacting Kevin. However, my mother advises caution, suggesting we uncover their intentions before they fabricate excuses, potentially complicating matters further. Deciding to record their conversation, my parents, a lawyer friend, and I agree to discuss the situation calmly before taking any further action. Upon arriving home, I began preparing dinner as usual when Kevin returned. Quickly, I started recording on my phone, discreetly keeping the screen facing down to avoid detection. To my surprise, Kevin immediately asked about my cash cards upon entering. When I inquired about his sudden interest, his responses were evasive, hinting at deceit. Remaining silent seemed to frustrate Kevin, and he grew somber, demanding all my part-time earnings for his sister. Firmly, I explained that the money was for Martin's savings, not to be diverted elsewhere. Angered by my refusal, Kevin shoved divorce papers from his bag towards me, accusing me of draining his finances and devaluing our son, Martin. His words struck a nerve, prompting me to cease dinner preparations, gather the divorce papers, and take Martin's hand, heading for the door. Kevin's threat of divorce echoed behind me, but I declared I wouldn't return to a home where strangers came and went freely. Reflecting on my words later, I questioned if I had been too harsh, especially considering Jane's relationship with Kevin. Ignoring Kevin's flurry of messages and calls, I turned off my phone and sought refuge at my parents' house. Upon arrival, I shared the recording and divorce papers with my parents. Their response was clear. I should do what was best for Martin, even if it meant divorcing Kevin. However, they acknowledged the potential emotional toll it could take on Martin. As I grappled with this decision, Martin expressed hunger, and my mother swiftly prepared his favorite meal, hamburgers. Tears welled in my eyes as Martin, with a heart full of kindness, shared his happiness with us. Overwhelmed by his gesture, I couldn't contain my emotions, and my father reassured Martin that my tears were of joy. Martin's innocent remark about Jane's absence brought forth more tears, and I embraced him tightly. Witnessing this exchange, my father's eyes mirrored my emotional turmoil, highlighting the weight of the situation on our family. I turned to Martin and remarked, "Isn't it wonderful to be with family?" His surprise was evident as he questioned whether Dad had only considered Jane as family. My father gently affirmed that, indeed, it was just us: Mom, Grandpa, Grandma, and Martin. Then he asked Martin if he wanted to stay with us as part of our family. With a laugh, Martin replied, "Of course. We're family," bringing smiles to everyone's faces. As we enjoyed our meal, filled with laughter and lively conversation, I couldn't help but wonder when was the last time we had such a natural, joyous gathering. Despite my contemplation of divorce, the happiness of the moment convinced me to go through with it and inform Martin. Although discussing divorce weighed heavily on my heart, Martin seemed to understand, expressing his happiness at living as a family. He eagerly embraced our pet dog, referring to him as his younger brother, despite the dog being older. Preparing for the divorce, I swiftly contacted a lawyer, arranging to meet the next day. That night, Martin slept peacefully with my father and the dog, their faint laughter offering comfort. As I laid in bed with my mother, memories of my childhood flooded my mind, lulling me to sleep. The next day, I was inundated with over 200 calls and messages from Kevin, showcasing his emotional turmoil. Exhausted by his instability, I turned off my phone once more. Meeting with the lawyer, we formalized the divorce proceedings. The lawyer explained that Kevin had become entangled in Jane's substantial debts, using my savings as a solution. Despite Kevin's attempts to reconcile, the divorce had been finalized. Later, I received a call from Kevin, his tone markedly different, devoid of aggression. He confessed to spoiling Jane and feeling jealous of Martin. Despite his plea for reconciliation, I remained resolute in my decision. Returning to my parents' house, I decided to stay until Martin grew up. Meanwhile, I resumed my role as company president, explaining the situation to my colleagues. Subsequently, Kevin and Jane were disowned by their parents due to their debt and the divorce, now living in a cramped apartment, constantly blaming each other. However, despite their turmoil, I found solace and happiness in being with my family.